Okay, so you guys sent us a transcript this time around. And it's a YouTube episode from Easy English Talk.
Right.
And it's titled Speak Confidently Anywhere Improve, Your English Speaking Practice Podcast.
Lots of keywords there.
Yeah.
To pack it all in.
Totally. And it's really interesting, as always. But what we really want to do today is, I think, distill it down to those key insights that can help people really speak English with more confidence.
Exactly. And that no matter what situation they find themselves in.
Right, exactly.
If you're listening to this, I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah.
You know, that feeling of, I want to say something, I have something I want to contribute, but I don't know if I'm saying it right.
Right, or you're just unsure it's going to come out the right way.
Yeah.
Is my grammar perfect? Am I using the right words?
Yeah, totally.
So we're really going to break that down today, I think. Absolutely.
And we're going to look at the why behind it. Why is it that you feel unconfident when you speak English? And then what are some fundamental shifts in perspective that you can use that can really unlock the confidence within you? And then finally, what are some practical techniques that you can start using right away? You know, and so those are kind of the 3 areas we're going to touch on. And then we can look at different social settings, how to cultivate good habits so that your English improves in the long term.
Okay, so let's jump right into the content here. Easy English Talk, which is hosted by Jason and Julia, they start out by posing a really fundamental question. They're saying, what are the reasons why so many people find it tough to speak English confidently? You know, what are the reasons behind this?
Yeah, I think an interesting thing is that no matter what source you look at, you know, whether it's books, whether it's online articles, courses, podcasts, like Easy English Talk, it always comes down to the same few things. And I think Easy English Talk, they sum it up really well, which is that there's the fear of making mistakes, which is a huge one. The worry that you're going to be judged by other people. The feeling that your vocabulary isn't big enough. And are good enough, or that your grammar isn't good enough. And then this overall sense of nervousness that can just really prevent you from speaking confidently.
And so let's break down some of these, I guess starting with that first one, which is the fear of making mistakes. And it's interesting because and I think a lot of times that comes from this idea that we have in our mind of this perfect English. And if we make any mistakes, we're somehow not reaching that ideal.
It is so true.
And it's funny because, you know, when we speak our native languages, we don't always speak perfectly.
Of course not. I mean, I can't think of a single time when I've spoken perfectly for an extended period of time.
We all stumble on our words. You know, we all
have to rephrase. Like, oh, wait, I actually meant this.
Totally.
You know?
Or we use filler words.
Right.
But I think the interesting thing,
and
I guess the point that they're making is that mistakes are actually a very vital part.
I think that's such a good way to put it.
Of learning. And it's funny because we're so afraid of them.
It is.
You know, it's like they're bad.
It's like
we shouldn't make mistakes.
And we try to avoid them at all costs. But actually, I think they can be really valuable feedback. Because what they tell you is, okay, this is an area where I'm stretching. This is an area where I'm encountering new territory. And so I think it's something that's natural. It's necessary. It's part of the process.
How we learn.
And I think if we can look at it that way as, oh, this is an opportunity for me to learn rather than, oh, I've done something wrong.
It's not a failure. And then there's this fear of judgment.
Too, which, I think that's a big one.
You know, I think it's tied in with that fear of making mistakes, but it's kind of like, I think it goes a little bit deeper. Well,
what if other people think, what are they thinking about me? Like, what
if they judge me?
Exactly.
Or this mistake.
Exactly.
Or for my...
I think it comes down to... I mean, if you look at it psychologically, like from a psychological standpoint, it comes down to a fear of vulnerability. You're putting yourself out there. You're making yourself vulnerable.
And it's saying, hey, I don't actually have a perfect grasp of this language.
Exactly. But I'm still going to try. And so I think a lot of people are really, really scared of that. But I think if you... you know, if we can all just step back for a second and really think about the people that you interact with.
Yeah. Are they really?
Are they really judging you, or are they trying to understand what you're saying?
Right. And I think most of the time,
I think so.
If they're
unless they're a terrible person.
Decent people.
A terrible person.
Yeah. They're really trying.
They're trying to meet you halfway.
Yeah.
They're trying to understand.
Totally. And even more so.
Right.
Like, put yourself in their position.
Yeah.
If you were speaking to someone.
Right.
And they were learning your native language.
Right.
Would you be judging them for their grammar mistakes?
And I think for most people, the answer is no.
Right.
Because you understand the effort
that they're trying.
Yeah, that they're making
exactly.
to communicate with you.
Totally. And they also bring up the point about not having enough vocabulary.
Okay.
Which is a big one too.
Right.
Because I think sometimes we feel like, I have this thought in my mind, but I just don't have the words to express it.
Right. Or I don't know the grammar well enough to communicate it in a way that I feel comfortable with.
Yeah, exactly.
And so
it's interesting.
I think that brings up a really important point, which is that, the goal of communication is to be understood.
Right.
Right. It's not necessarily to use the biggest words possible or the most complex grammatical structures.
Right. It's really just to get your point across clearly.
Yeah. And effectively.
Yeah.
And I think what Easy English Talk is saying is that you can actually communicate very, very effectively with a relatively set of vocabulary as long as you use it strategically and precisely.
Yeah, it's about being resourceful with what you have.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's and being creative.
And I think that leads into this idea of nervousness.
Right.
Because often we're nervous because we feel like we're not good enough. Or we don't know enough.
It all ties in together. Yeah.
And
they had this nice little story.
Yeah, they did. They gave a nice anecdote about a student or a learner, rather, who was able to overcome a lot of this nervousness through constant practice and speaking every single day.
And I think that's really telling because
it is.
It really boils it down to the fact that, a lot of times this nervousness stems from this idea that we have in our head that we're not good enough or that we don't know enough.
Yeah.
But, when you put in the time, when you put in the effort, you can really see improvement. And that improvement is what really builds your confidence.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And it also
it's like this self-fulfilling prophecy almost.
Right. And I think they also talk about how the more you expose yourself to these situations where you're speaking, even if it's just low-stakes situations, like talking to yourself or talking to a friend, that nervousness tends to go down because you're building that familiarity.
Yeah, it's like anything. If you do it enough times, you get more and more.
You get more comfortable.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big takeaways from Easy English Talk is that this journey to confidence really starts with what's going on inside your head.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit.
Sure.
Because I think that's a good transition here to this idea of the mindset shift.
Exactly.
Right.
And I think
so
a big thing here is that we need to reframe how we look at learning.
Okay.
And so I think a lot of learners get stuck in this crap of thinking that they need to be perfect, to be confident.
Right.
And so what we want to do is we want to move away from this idea of perfect English and towards an idea of progress, continuous progress.
Yeah.
And so
it's almost like giving ourselves permission to be a learner.
Exactly. And I think that's so important.
And I think about little kids.
Right.
They make tons of mistakes when they're learning how to speak.
All the time.
But they're not afraid of it.
Yeah.
And they just keep going.
Right.
And it's amazing because if you think about it, they're actually learning so quickly.
Yeah, they're like little sponges.
Yeah,
they're just absorbing everything.
And they're not afraid to try. And
and I think, they're just experimenting. They're playing. Yeah, and they're having fun.
Yeah.
And that's why they learn.
Yeah, I think there's something to be said for that.
And so I think if we can approach language learning with the same attitude, it can be really liberating.
Yeah.
Because we're not so afraid of making a mistake.
Right. And every mistake becomes this opportunity.
Right.
Learn rather than...
It's not something to be afraid of.
Yeah.
It's just data.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's funny because... we're so good at doing that in other areas of our lives.
Yes.
Like if we're learning new.
Exactly. Like think about learning how to ride a bike.
We're going to make mistakes.
You're going to fall down.
And that's how we're going to learn.
But you get back up.
Yeah.
You keep going.
Yeah. But with language, I think we're so hard on ourselves. Sometimes
we have this different standard.
Yeah.
And I don't
know why.
I don't know why that is.
Yeah.
But it's something
really interesting
to be aware of.
Yeah. And then, of course, they bring up the point about positive self-talk,
right?
Which I think is so important.
It's huge. I think that the things that we tell ourselves really matter and have a huge impact on our self-belief.
And if we're constantly putting ourselves down.
Yeah, if you're constantly saying
it becomes this
negative cycle.
Yeah.
I'm never going to be fluent. I'm not good at this.
And then it becomes true.
It does.
Because you're not giving yourself
a chance to improve.
Yeah.
And
so what they recommend doing is they say really actively challenge
those negative thoughts and replace them with positive affirmations.
So instead of saying my English is terrible, you would say something like I'm improving.
I am actively improving my English every day.
Yeah.
Or I can communicate my ideas effectively.
Yeah.
And it sounds simple.
Yeah. But
when you
powerful.
Consistently do this, it can really change how you view yourself.
Yeah. It's amazing. And I think
so important.
They had that really interesting tip they called the mirror affirmation.
Right.
Which was
that I thought was brilliant.
I thought it was really interesting too.
Yeah. So what they said is, start your day by looking in the mirror and saying a positive sentence about your English, right?
And the idea is that
priming. That you're priming
your mind,
your subconscious mind. Yeah. You're setting the tone for the day.
Yeah. Totally.
And it's a
small, consistent little act.
Yeah.
But it can have huge consequences.
It can build over time.
Yeah.
And I think
totally. And then finally, they touch on this point about not comparing yourself to
other people.
Which is so
hard.
It's so hard, especially now
today's world
with social media.
Yeah.
You're constantly bombarded with other people's highlight reels.
Yeah.
Totally. You're not seeing the behind the scenes.
You're not seeing the mistakes they're making.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
So you get caught in this trap
to feel inadequate
of comparing and so you're comparing yourself to someone who's maybe been learning for 10 years.
Yeah.
You've been learning for 1 year.
Yeah.
And so
it's not a fair comparison.
It's not a fair comparison at all.
And so what they say is focus on
your own journey,
your own trajectory. Yeah.
Are you better today than you were yesterday? That's
Are you understanding
measure of success
more than you did a month ago?
Right.
And
I think that's so powerful.
If you can really just hone in on that and block out all the other noise, it can make such a big difference.
Yeah. And I think that brings us to this practical
the rubber meets the road.
Techniques.
Right.
Yeah.
The actual techniques.
What can you actually do?
Yeah. What can you actually do to improve?
Right. And so they have some great tips.
Yeah. I thought the first one was really interesting.
Okay.
Which is practicing speaking regularly. And they made the point that it doesn't have to be with another minute.
It doesn't have to be. You can talk to yourself.
Right. So they said, talk to yourself.
I say, describe what you're doing.
Yeah. Describe your surroundings.
Yeah.
Verbalize your thoughts.
Yeah.
Which just might seem a little
strange.
Weird at first.
But it's really effective.
And it's about getting your mouth used to forming.
Right. It's like a mental warm-up. It's like a physical warm-up for your mouth.
Yeah, exactly.
You can even record yourself speaking.
Yeah.
Which I think can be a little
uncomfortable.
Intimidating at first.
Yeah.
But it can provide really valuable feedback.
It can. Yeah.
Right. And I think they also had a great point about using simpler sentences.
Simple sentences?
Right. Yeah. And I think
there's this temptation
fall into the trap of thinking
to try to sound more advanced.
Right.
So if we're trying to use all this really complex grammar, you might actually be making more mistakes.
You might actually be sounding less confident.
Yeah, you might.
Because you're stumbling over your words.
Less fluent, yeah.
Right. Exactly. So I think they're saying, focus on clarity, not complexity.
Yeah.
And so
instead of saying something like, I would like to acquire information regarding, you could just say,
could you tell me about,
and
that's
and it's so much,
it's more direct. It's easier to understand. And I think ultimately that's where the confidence comes.
That's where the confidence comes from. Exactly. Right. And then
they say, prioritize fluency.
Yes.
Over
grammar.
Which I think is a really interesting point because we get so caught up with being perfect.
It is important.
And having perfect grammar.
But I think ultimately.
But when you're in the act of speaking, it's more important to keep the conversation going, to keep that flow.
Yeah. And to be making so hung up on
tiny little grammar mistakes.
Yeah.
You're probably going to lose your train of thought.
Sound less fluent.
Right. And it's going to make it harder for the other person to understand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think they made a great point, which is
it's his balance.
Grammatical accuracy is important.
Right. But in the moment,
fluency is often
more important.
More important, yeah.
Yeah.
And then they talked about body language.
Body language.
And facial expressions.
Which I
thought was a really interesting
because we often think about
point. Because
the coast.